Welcome to the Bobby O Show. My name is Bobo Potzner, and I think it's going to be a very interesting show for you all today with an author with his first nonfiction book. It's a fiction book, fiction novel. His name is Rod Dillman. I want to talk to you a little bit about setting up this show and what the book is about. As we approach the holiday season, we all in the United States have much to be thankful for. But unfortunately, if we're realistic and aware of what's going on in society, we have a country that's deeply divided. Probably more deeply divided than any time since the Civil War back in the 1850s and 60s. But our country has had division in other eras, and one such era was during the Vietnam War in the 1970s. I was a young kid at that point in time, and at that point in time, we had a great involvement in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and over 58,000 American soldiers died in that conflict. The American leadership eventually decided to get out of Vietnam under President Richard Nixon, but a lot of that involvement in Vietnam to have us get out of the war was led by college student protests. And no college was probably more significant in the protest movement and what happened on the campus than Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, where on May 4, 1970, about 5 days after President Nixon extended the war from Vietnam to Cambodia, but on May 4, 1970, there was student protests, and eventually on that day, Ohio National Guardsmen shot and killed 4 Kent State students. 9 more were injured, including one who became paralyzed for life. And that activity, that involvement with the National Guard and the student murders on Kent State campus led immediately to a much greater involvement by student protesters nationally in colleges across the campus. And Rod Dillman, a friend of mine from law school, from Lima, Ohio, been a friend for years since law school, was from Lima, Ohio, went to Kent State University, and he wrote a historical novel about what happened at Kent State in 1970. And the book is called Flowers Are Better Than Bullets by Rodney Dillman. And Rod's going to talk about the book and other things today. Rod, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Bobby. Thanks for having me on your show.
It's my pleasure. I've read the book. Actually, I was a beta editor of the book with you, and thank you for the acknowledgement. It's a very good book, and I say that not just because you're my friend. Tell me a little about your background before we get into the book itself.
Sure. As you mentioned, I grew up in northwestern Ohio, Lima. It's a town of about 50,000, blue-collar town in northwestern Ohio. And then I went to Kent State. I started in September of 1970 at Kent State. So the events Bob was just talking about occurred in May of 1970. So some 4 months after those events occurred, I started at Kent State and went on, got my undergraduate degree there, got my master's in economics from Kent State. And then I went to law school at Duke with Bobby O, and that's where we met. After law school, I practiced law in Connecticut and Massachusetts for about 35 years. And it was an investment lawyer. Then I went on a number of, became an executive at a international insurance company. And then I retired and became on board of directors of various mutual funds. And then about a year ago, I started writing this novel, and it just went to publication last Wednesday on Amazon.
Rod, tell me what caused you to decide to write this book.
Well, Bob, it was, it had always been in the back of my mind that I have a novel in me waiting to come out. And about 10 years ago, I thought about writing this book, and I couldn't quite get there in my mind as to how to structure and organize it. And then, like I said, in September of 2022, I said, well, it's now or never. And I came up with a format that's an interesting format that you alluded to, where I rotate through 3 separate timelines. And so it makes it interesting for the reader that it's not written chronologically, but rather in 3 timelines. Each individual timeline is chronological, but it flips back and forth between the timelines.
Rod, it was hard when I read the book, and I have not actually read the book as it now exists in this final form. I read it in the prior draft, and I was finding myself wanting to skip from one timeline to the other. I want to see what happened in certain stories when you met a young lady in the book, but I didn't do that. But it's very interesting the way you did it because it makes you go back and forth. What is your goal? What's your theme that you're trying to get across to people in this historical novel?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of major themes going on. The first is that, as Bob mentioned, the book takes place in the mid '60s, late '60s, and then early 1970, and that was the height of the Vietnam War. Even in 1970, the U.S. still had over 400,000 troops stationed in Vietnam, and there were literally thousands of men and women dying in the war every month. And so, my thought was the Kent State shooting sort of brought the war home, the Vietnam War home to the United States, because now we had innocent students who were unarmed, who were shot and killed and injured by the Ohio National Guard. So the first theme is, is free speech really free, even in a country that proclaims that if you can get killed for speaking out your voice in protest against the war in Vietnam? And so that's the first theme. And then the second theme is really a coming of age. It really goes through what it was like to be a teenager in the late 1960s and then going off to college, and what it was like to be a freshman at Kent State University in 1969 and 1970.
Rod, it's called a historical novel. And in reading the book, how much of the history part, how much of the book with respect to what happened at Kent State the day or two before and all that leading up to the shooting, how much of that historical part of it is actual factually?
Yeah, all the historical facts are accurate. They were well researched. Took me a lot of time, excuse me, to research those facts, and so even that the period of time is called the setting is the bayonets and bullets sections of the book. The chapters relating to Kent State from May 1st to May 4, 1970. Everything in there relating to what happened with the protests and the National Guardsmen is as historically accurate as I could make it. And then even, in the other sections of the book, the coming of age section, which is called Teens and Dreams, there were historical references to not only the music at the time, the Beatles, the Supremes, and then the landing on the moon. And there's a lot of historical references in the book as to what happened at that time. TV shows, all those are historically accurate, have been researched to make sure the time frame is correct, what was said and done within those historical contexts is correct.
And I believe there was a song written by Neil Young about the Kent State shooting, was there not?
Yeah, there's a song called Ohio. You'll recall that the theme is, or the refrain is "For Dead in Ohio." It's written by Neil Young of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and that song was written just 2 weeks after the May 4th shootings occurred.
When I was in high school, and I was a couple of years below you in grade level, in terms of you were, I think, 1 or 2 years ahead of me in school until law school, I remember the Kent State shooting. I remember being very moved. Now, I was from Shelton, Connecticut, middle-class community. I don't know if it's much likely in Lima, Ohio or not, but it's a middle-class community. And the kids who were protesting the Vietnam War in the late 60s, early 70s, were deemed to be, quote, the hippies, unquote, whatever that meant. But this, when I learned about the shooting, it really moved me. In fact, I remember going to the library, looking at the microfiche machine, and in those days it was different how you research in the libraries. But I was very moved by what happened at Kent State, and I think nationwide that had a very big impact on campuses across the country. Am I right, Rod?
Yeah, the immediately after May 4, 1970, over 100 college campuses across the U.S. had protests, and fortunately, those protests did not end in any more deaths, but it really led to, it was the beginning of the end of the Vietnam War, because Richard Nixon had promised in his campaign to end the war, but was slow in ending it. And was really most people and most historians agree that the Kent State protests and ultimate shootings led to the end of accelerated the end of the U.S. Involvement in Vietnam. So that involvement ended in March of 1973.
My daughter went to Miami of Ohio, as you know, Rod, and I think it was her junior year. She got to bring her car to college campus, and so I drove her to Oxford, Ohio, which is about 6-7 hours, I guess it was, from Kent, Ohio. But we stopped one night at Kent on the way back, away toward school, and I went to the Kent campus, Kent State University campus, and I went to the area where there's a statute and various other activities where the shooting occurred.
Right.
And even though I did that in like 2009, 10, whatever it was, I could still feel, this may sound bizarre, but I could still feel the death in the air. And I thought the memorial that was done at Kent State was overwhelming. The thing that really concerned me and made me feel so terribly is that some of the people who were killed were hundreds and hundreds of feet away from where the protest rally was. In fact, I think one student was walking to class who was shot. What's that story?
Yeah, I mean, it was really indiscriminate firing. I mean, the shots that were fired by the Ohio National Guard, that, as you said, Bob, one of the students that was killed, Sandy Shore, was 370 feet away. She was shot in the back as she was walking to class. Another student was 700 feet away, wasn't anywhere near the protest, but yet the M1 rifles that were used had a range of over a mile. So with lethal force of over a mile. So they were shooting bullets that could, injure people over a mile away. So, these students were shot anywhere from 60 feet to 700 feet away from the National Guards. They were unarmed. There were no shots by students or anybody else fired at the National Guard. There were some rocks thrown by students, but, it was just sort of simultaneously, all the guards turned and fired at the students.
In fact, Rod, in your opening of your book, aside from dedicating the book to your wife, Laura, who's a wonderful lady, in fact, she used to make Thanksgiving dinner for us down in Durham, North Carolina.
That's right.
When I was in school there. But it says here in your opening, to the memory of Allison Krauss, Jeffrey Miller, Sandy Shore, and Bill Schroeder, the four bright souls whose lives were tragically cut short on May 4, 1970. Your spirits remain undimmed, echoing through the annals of history and reminding us of the cost of freedom and the importance of peaceful protest. I thought that was overwhelming. Also, you listed the 9 students who were injured, and one of the students, I believe, was paralyzed for life. Is that correct?
That's right. Dean Kaler was paralyzed from the waist down for life, and he is still in a wheelchair to this day.
The last part of your dedication was, quote, "This novel is dedicated to you all. May your stories continue to inspire generations to come, reminding them of the sacrifices made for justice, peace, and a better world," unquote. How timely is that dedication when we're facing in our society today a lot of college campuses having protests over the Hamas-Israel war? And I think the message in part has to be that freedom of speech is one thing, but you got to be careful how you exercise your freedom of speech. Any comment about that, Rod?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there will always be wars and conflicts around the world, and what we've seen is that it's difficult to come to grips with the right and wrong of these wars. Whether we're talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine or the Hamas slaughtering 1,400 Israelis, it's hard for us to understand the right and wrong of those situations. But as it was at Kent State, protests will be involved on both sides of these issues typically, and on both sides, whether the right or wrongness of war, and there is a cost to pay for those protests at times, and that's what the students at Kent State saw, where four ended up dead and 9 wounded on May 4th, 1970.
Now, I don't want people to get the wrong idea, because the Kent State shooting is the setting and the historical part of the book, but there's much more to this book that makes it very interesting. The character development I thought was very interesting to me, how you did it, and I kept going ahead to see, is he going to get the date with that girl or not? And I know it's a historical fiction novel because the guy in the book who's the lead had a great romantic life, and I'm sure you would have liked to have been as romantically involved as he was with all the girls involved. But seriously, talk about how you do the character development, because I'm sure that's not easy to do, and it did keep my attention to the subplot about his relationships. What's the name of the main character, please, in his latest girlfriend?
Yeah, the main character's name is Johnny, and the girl he meets at Kent State during the second week of class is named Katie, and so yeah, it's as I said, a coming of age story about Johnny and Katie. Johnny growing up in a high school, and what happens as he's growing up. His, as Bob said, alluded to, it has some romantic moments in it, and it is ultimately a love story between Johnny and Katie, and because they become involved not only with each other romantically, but also in the protests against the war in Vietnam. So that's the setting. Obviously, all of that is the fictional part of the book, but the actual protests they are involved in are historically accurate.
I'm not going to give away the plot in any way, shape, or form, but all the way through, I was thinking to myself, what happens to Katie? What happens to Johnny in the book? And I let the readers read that and find it for themselves. But I thought your character development for your first novel. I'm not an English major. All my books are pretty much non-fiction. Yours is one of the few fiction books that I read. But I think it's important to see how you develop the character. How do you go about doing that as you're writing, to make sure that A leads to B, leads to C, and that kind of thing? Keep the interest of the audience. How'd you go about doing that? Because you're not a professional writer. Well, you are now, but you were not before you wrote this book.
Yeah, it's interesting, Bob, because if you just talk about everyday life for most people, it's pretty uninteresting. And so when you're writing a novel, you have to really talk about things that are going to be of interest to people reading the book, and you have to have some conflict in there, keep the action moving. And so when you're thinking about, when I was thinking about writing this novel, I took inspiration from things that happened in my life and the events that occurred around me, the historical events that were happening at the time in the late 60s and the early 1970s. And then, when you create these characters, you're basically having them develop through what they're doing. So you're writing vignettes, if you will, of characters and set in various locations and involved in various activities that makes it a really good, interesting story. And that's basically, so when I was writing, I kept thinking about, okay, if I'm a reader, am I going to be interested in this scene, or is it just another day in the life of a high school student or a college student? So I chose scenes and activities, and then from my past, I fictionalized them to make them more interesting, obviously, and then added some romance in there to really round it out.
And by the way, Bobby O is not a character in the novel. We know that for sure.
That's for sure.
Is there any part of the book that you wrote, Rob, that you're most proud of?
I think the really the May 1st to May 4th part of it is really the part that I'm most proud of, and it really was the initial inspiration for the book, because every May 4 at Kent State, since the shootings occurred, they hold a commemoration ceremony. And my wife and I have been involved in those while we were at Kent State. I met my wife also at Kent State. And so, for example, I can remember her standing vigil at the site of one. They have as Bob said, a memorial to each of the 4 students who were killed there. And I can remember her, they would do a 24-hour vigil on May 4th. And I can remember my wife standing there with a candle, at that vigil. And so I believe it really was the May 1 to May 4th component of the book, which is is the chapters entitled "Bandits and Bullets," that really brings home what happened, and is something we really shouldn't forget. I think in terms of our history of this country.
As a matter of fact, weren't you student body president of Kent State your senior year?
I was well. They did abolish the traditional student government and had a student caucus, and I was president of the student caucus, which was the equivalent of the student body president at that time. So I was very much involved with the board of trustees of Kent State University and the president of Kent State, and the president of Kent State was a Methodist minister, and he actually married my wife and I after we graduated on the front campus of Kent State University.
When was the last time you were back at Kent State University?
I was there just last year in December of 2022. I spent 3 days in the archives of the Kent State Library researching the book, because you can find a lot of material online now, but there are some material in the archives that are really just sort of lumped together in boxes. And so I went through literally hundreds of boxes of materials to find some of the things I was looking for. For example, there were leaflets distributed about the rallies that the Kent State University administration was trying to control the narrative, and there were protests going on, and so the university was trying to establish, restrictions on the students as to what they could do, and then the town of Kent also put restrictions on what students could do. And I wanted to find those actual flyers that were distributed to the students, and I was able to do that and then reproduce them accurately in the book so that you could get a feel for what was going on. And then they also had, it was really interesting, the campus radio station called WKSU had recorded raw footage of the protest, and it was unnarrated. It was just the raw footage. It was a recorder that was going during the protest, and even at the time of the shooting. So, I listened to that raw footage, which went on for a couple of hours, and I could really feel like you were there, because you heard the protest, you heard the shouts, you heard the students screaming at the National Guardsmen, you heard the shots, and then the moans and groans and the the chaotic atmosphere that occurred after it. So it was that research at Kent State that really led to and put sort of the finishing touches on the book. And then I listened to hours and hours of oral history from both students and professors and even National Guardsmen who were at Kent State at the time to get the feeling and the flow of what was going on from all the participants' perspectives.
One reason I asked you when you were last on campus was to get a sense for if you were there last year. So it'd be about 40 plus years, almost 50 years since the event happened.
Right.
Is there any sense from the student body, if you talk to any kids at all, of the significance of what happened in Kent State in 1970, or is it just it's history?
No, I think there is. There's the memorial that you were talking about that has all the places where the students were shot are actually memorialized with a brass plaque. And then now there is a May 4th memorial. It's not a museum, but it's a demonstration. And so you go in, they have a really nice video of what happened that was put together. And then there's a lot of memorabilia from the students and from the protests at that time. So it still is front and center and top of mind by the administration and I think a lot of the students at Kent State.
Am I correct that all the shooting happened over 13 seconds? Is that where the shooting was?
It did, yeah. And so
a very short period of time, changing people's lives forever. What was the reaction of the National Guard's people? I guess there were 28 who I think shot. Was 28 the right number, if I follow correctly? What was the reaction of the National Guard as time went by, retrospectively?
Well, the National Guard were never found guilty of anything, and so there were several cases, criminal cases that were brought that were ultimately dismissed, and so the National Guard were deemed protected in their actions, even though there were many who thought that something else should have happened. So over the years, those cases were dismissed. There was a civil settlement that actually occurred, where I think the students' parents the students who were shot got $15,000, and the students who were wounded got $7,500. So that it was really relatively minor amounts of money for to be compensated for what happened there.
Did you have a target audience that you were writing this book for?
I do. I think that anyone who enjoys historical fiction or coming of age fiction is going to enjoy this book. I think baby boomers who grew up and lived in the 1960s and 1970s, I think you'll find a lot of things that you can relate to in the book. And then I think it's a good book for book clubs. I think book clubs, there's a lot in there to talk about from readers of in book clubs. You can generate some very good discussion, I think. And ultimately, I think the residents of Ohio, people who are from Ohio or who have an affiliation with Kent State, either an alumnus. There's over 230,000 living alumni of Kent State. So, I
Rod,
think
we have about 2 minutes. I'm sorry, we have about 2 minutes left in the show. Couple of things. You're going back to Kent State, I believe, to have a book signing of some type.
We're going to schedule that. Yeah, we haven't scheduled it yet, but that's one of our hopes is that will occur. Yeah.
That would be, I think, very, very interesting to see what happens. Can you give me in the last minute or two, you have a summary of the experience you've had in writing this book and what people can look for in reading your novel?
Yeah, I think it was really a dream come true for me to finish the novel. And I think if you want a book where you are really want to be engaged in the history of the time, and it can take you right back. If you're a baby boomer, it will take you right back to your teenage years. I think you'll enjoy that book.
Rod, do you have a website if people wanted to find out more about you as a writer and you about this book? Is there a website you have, and tell us to it very slowly?
Sure, it's www.rodneydillman.com, RODNEYDILLMAN.com, and it will take you through what the summary of the book, what it's all about, and where you can get it.
Rod, it's been a pleasure, first of all, knowing you for all these years. You're a wonderful person. I'm a bit prejudiced toward you and your wife, Laura, and your family, a great family. Rod's a person of integrity, and if you'll really enjoy his book. And thank you for forgiving me for going to the Final Four in 2022 when you got COVID and I didn't, and also Duke lost to Carolina, which is not a great thing. But I want to thank you very much for appearing on the show, and I hope people buy this book and read it and enjoy it, because it's a tragic situation, but there are some silver linings, what we can learn from that experience, and also it'll be a fun read.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This has been Bobo Potsner on another edition of The Bobby O Show. See you soon. Have a great Thanksgiving.